What up, world? This is Tracy with Real Life Counseling in Northern Michigan. And recently I had the opportunity to interview Chip Sauer, who is the lead pastor at Community Reformed Church in Charlevoix, Michigan. And we talked a little bit about emotional intelligence, which is a term that a lot of folks are not familiar with. And it has to do with anxiety and how we deal with anxiety. Our interview got kind of long, so I'm going to break it up in 3 different parts. And I highly recommend you spend the time and listen to what Chip has to say because it is brilliant. So, without further ado, here we go. Emotional intelligence, Chip Sauer, pastor of Community Reformed Church in Charlevoix, Michigan, the legend.
In my own eyes.
Yeah, yep. Which is what's really the only thing that's important.
It's true.
So you gave a really cool presentation to me and a group of young life people years ago, and it just blew my mind and really shaped the way that I see the way that people think. And I needed a review. I need a recap, and I want to know how can it help the teens and the parents that that I see every week. So what is emotional intelligence? How would you give it an overview?
Yeah. So, I mean, the two things that come to mind have to do with anxiety and the impact of anxiety in people's lives and the reality of anxiety. And in some ways, I think a lack of understanding of what anxiety is, I think is an important part of this conversation. I think that anxiety is something we experience as human beings. It's inevitable, and in some ways, part of the work of being a follower of Jesus Christ is to create some level of anxiety. Jesus sure did a good job of that.
Yeah, I've come to comfort the uncomforted. Yeah.
Yep. But I think part of the growth for all of us is the growing capacity we have to be who we want to be in the midst of our anxiety. And so much of what I see and so much of what I've seen within myself is how often anxiety lends itself to lead to an emotional response that's far different from who I want to be. And so, so my son and I are having a difficult conversation, and he's kind of throwing a little tantrum, but as that conversation unfolds and I get more emotionally fired up, all of a sudden I'm throwing a tantrum right back at him. And so we're yelling, we're raising voices, and that's not who I want to be.
And you've kind of de-escalated down to his level and dropped down to his level, and that's not...
Nope.
You're the adult.
Right, so I think a big part of this whole concept of emotional maturity, emotional intelligence is being able to seeing yourself more and more clearly, and seeing kind of how you are in the midst of anxiety. And it's why one of the books that I'm going to recommend is, and this one is probably one of the key ones I'd encourage you to take a chance to look at, but it begins to open up this reality that to be a leader, as God calls us to be, means we have to be able to see ourselves in the midst of anxiety. And it gives some very practical, what are common responses to anxiety that happen within our lives. And it's based primarily on family systems theory. Murray Bowen is a kind of a key name in the conversation. Bowen has done a ton of work that's been incredibly helpful and has really impacted, I think, in a lot of ways, kind of the conversation about how we walk through our understanding of how anxiety affects us, how we grow in terms of emotional maturity. And so this book is based somewhat on family systems theory. It's written by 3 people who have been voices in the life of the church. But even beyond that, really seeing what it means to be a leader and the leadership piece without, when I went through seminary, there wasn't any opportunity, there wasn't any classes on emotional maturity, there wasn't any, how do you deal with your own anxiety, right? It was theological training, it was how do you handle congregational people, that type of thing.
Nothing about self-care. Okay. The book is called The Leader's Journey, Accepting the Call to Personal and Congregational Transformation, and I'll put a link down in the
Yep.
doobly-doo.
Yeah, so what, part of just some of the basic information that it surfaces is so there's 4 common responses to anxiety
Okay.
that are prevalent universally. Doesn't matter culturally, across the board. And they are you either distance. So when you're feeling anxious, you internalize. You can kind of pull away inside. Or sometimes you just walk away. And we've all been in those circumstances where we just don't want to deal with the anxiety we're feeling. And so like the typical church meeting where you have a leader who's a leader in the church gets mad and walks out. Or a husband and wife are having a difficult conversation and one of them just walks away or drives away. Right? That's a pretty typical response. Is to distance. You just want to get out of the experience of the anxiety so you can physically distance, or you can do it kind of internally. So sitting at a meeting, it starts to get a little bit hot. You just kind of fold your
Shut
arms.
down.
Yep, you shut down. So you distance.
So that's the one.
That's one. Second one is conflict. So you're much more kind of that fight or flight kind of understanding when you're cornered. Instead of running, you attack.
Mm-hmm.
You name call, you raise your voice, you fight. You all of a sudden it's black and white thinking, it's us and them, it's agree, disagree, you're right or wrong. I mean, and there's nothing helpful in that, especially when it comes to any sense of listening. If one of the core ways that we express love to one another is to listen, when you are in the attack mode, right? When you're in conflict, nobody's listening.
Nope. It's like, so right now it's either fight or flight. I mean, those are the two.
Yep. The third one is often seen within what we would call gossiping within the church. So basically, the language of family systems theory is projection. But so you and I have a difficult conversation, and I'm anxious about it, right? Maybe you said something hard to me that's hard for me to hear. Well, the way that I deal with my anxiety is I go talk to somebody else about you. And I criticize you or I complain about you, but I deal with my anxiety by kind of pushing it off onto somebody else who all of a sudden now takes on some of that anxiety because they're like, oh man, Jake and Chip aren't getting along. Holy cow, I wonder what that means, all of that. So one of the ways that we deal with that anxiety is we surface it to other people. And the other one is what they call overfunctioning or underfunctioning, which is, I just see this so clearly in my own life that at church, so like we have a consistory retreat coming up this weekend, and the way that I deal with the anxiety around that retreat is I try to take it on all by myself and do everything and make decisions about what's going to take place. So I overfunction. I don't invite other leaders or other staff into the conversation about the planning, about what we're going to do. I take it all on. I
Get
take
into control freak mode.
Yep.
Yeah.
I take more responsibility than is mine to take. Or we underfunction, and that's more typical for me at home, which is, I get on my iPad, I get on my phone, and I'm like, yeah, I can see that dishes need to be done and kids need attention and all of that, but I'm just going to kind of focus on me. And that kind of forces my wife to have to do more than her responsibility.
Which kind of has something to do with it being distant.
Yeah.
And they're similar to that.
Yep. Right, and so one of the classic examples is, so you've got a son or daughter who's going to, it's their junior, senior year, and they're trying to figure out where to go to college. Well, they're not taking responsibility like you want them to take, so mom fills out the college applications, dad writes the papers. That's over-functioning. It's taking more responsibility. Those are all...
Because they're anxious.
Because they're anxious. They're all responses to our anxiety. And so I think that, to me, has been, in some ways, transformational. And part of what the Leader's Journey also does is it not only looks at that in terms of what we do individually, but it looks at that in terms of what happens in our churches. That there, it's not just anxiety affects an individual, anxiety affects systems. And that's one of the things that I think has been so transformational in my understanding, is learning to look at systems. So the church is a system, your family is a system. Any place that there's some relationships, there's a system.
Community, governments.
Yeah.
Schools.
And so systems are impacted by anxiety. And it's so clear to see, right now the power of fear within our culture, especially around the political realm. I mean, what do all these candidates do? They spur on fear, the fear of what could come. They create anxiety to encourage people to vote for them.
I mean, I can fix
right,
it. I
exactly.
can solve your anxiety.
Right. If you vote for Trump or you vote for Clinton, the world's going to end. Right. It's an apocalypse. It's basically, that's the message that's used to kind of, and people buy into it. They get anxious. They're afraid. Man, if I vote for so and so, that's going to happen. I've got to. And it's not a well thought out. It's not an emotionally mature. It's more of a reactive, and that's kind of the key word, I think. Anxiety leads us to be reactive.
Yeah, it's that gut reaction. It's that first response.
Yep. So being reactive is very different than being reflective. And reactive is driven by, I want to get out of this anxiety as quick as I can. Reflective is more based on, I want to be who I want to be, who God's called me to be. I want to live out of the values that I hold. I want to be the person that God has called me to be, instead of letting the anxiety in the system lead me to respond in an unhelpful and unhealthy way. So, I mean, I think that's so attached to emotional maturity. And you excuse me, just take a look at Jesus' life. Jesus, you look at the interactions we had, and they were often very anxious situations. So whether it's the woman caught in adultery, whether it's being confronted by the Pharisees, whether it's facing these incredible people in need who are very anxious about what they're experiencing, it's fascinating to watch Jesus' response. You know, as he's standing before Pilate and his life is on the line, it's interesting to watch how he navigated handling himself in the midst of those circumstances. It wasn't, he didn't have emotion, it wasn't that he didn't experience anxiety.
He just acted reflectively as opposed to his gut reaction.
He was always operating out of who he is. He wasn't allowing the emotion to drive his behavior and be somebody he doesn't want to be.
Thank you for listening all the way to the end of our first installment. And thank you so much, Chip, for sharing your wisdom. The rest of our interview will be made available very soon in the second and third installments right here at reallifecounselor.com. I'm Jake Tracy. Thanks for listening.